The nightclub was alive with energy, pulsating with the latest hits that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Joe, caught in the whirl of lights and laughter, found himself in a heated debate with his friend Matt over another round of shots. They were standing at the edge of the VIP zone, where a group of their friends were lounging around a table, immersed in the night's revelries. "Come on, Matt, it's just one more round," Joe pleaded, his voice barely rising above the music. Matt shook his head firmly, the colorful lights casting shifting shadows on his face. "Joe, we've had enough, man. You too. Let's not end the night on a bad note." Joe's plea turned into a back and forth, his words growing sharper with each exchange. "Since when did you turn into such a buzzkill?" Joe's frustration bubbled over, the alcohol fueling his irritation. Matt stood his ground, his concern for Joe clear in his eyes. "It's not about being a buzzkill. It's about knowing when to stop." The tension between them snapped as Joe, fueled by a mixture of defiance and the buzz of alcohol, shoved Matt away with a burst of anger. "Fine. If you won't join me, I don't need you to have fun," Joe declared, storming off towards the bar, leaving a stunned Matt in his wake. Minutes later, Joe returned triumphantly, balancing a tray laden with shots, a wide grin plastered across his face. The group erupted into cheers at the sight, the earlier altercation forgotten in the face of more drinks. Joe's infectious enthusiasm spread through the group as they all reached for the shots, toasting to the night and downing them in unison. As the laughter and chatter resumed, a girl sitting next to Joe leaned in, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something that made his grin widen. The music and the collective noise of the club swallowed their exchange, leaving it a mystery to everyone but them. Meanwhile, Matt, who had watched the scene unfold with a mix of concern and resignation, noticed Joe's jacket draped over a chair. Seizing a moment when all eyes were on Joe and his whispered conversation, Matt discreetly picked up the jacket. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was watching, he slipped his hand into one of the pockets and removed something, tucking it into his own pocket with a subtle move. The night had taken a toll on Joe, the alcohol rendering the world around him a dizzying blur. With a girl clinging to each arm, he stumbled out of the nightclub, their laughter mingling with the distant thump of the bass from inside. The cool night air did little to sober him up as they teetered on the edge of the sidewalk, the girls peppering him with questions about his car. "Where'd you park, Joe?" one of them slurred, her words barely cutting through the fog in his mind. Joe squinted at the sea of vehicles, his car nowhere to be seen in the dimly lit street. Panic began to set in, further fueled by his inebriated state. He patted his pockets in a clumsy attempt to find his keys, his movements erratic and uncoordinated. When his hands came up empty, he plunged them into the inner pockets of his jacket with a growing sense of desperation. Still, no keys. A string of curses escaped him as he turned on his heel, the girl's questions fading into the background. He barged back into the nightclub, the sudden assault of lights and sound making his head spin even more. Matt was right where Joe had left him, sipping on a soda amidst the chaos. The sight of him seemed to anchor Joe, if only slightly. "Did you take my damn keys, Matt?" Joe demanded, his voice laced with accusation. Without a word, Matt stood, the resignation in his eyes speaking volumes. "Let's get you home," he said, his tone even but firm. But Joe wasn't having any of it. With a shove, he snatched the keys from Matt's hand, the action sparking a flash of anger in Matt's eyes that quickly faded to a weary sigh. Matt shook his head, a silent admission of defeat. He was tired, so tired of playing the guardian to a man who refused to be saved from himself. When Joe stepped back outside, the girls were gone, vanished as quickly as the night's jubilance. Joe's drive home was a blur of adrenaline and disregard, his sleek sports car cutting through the quiet streets like a knife. The speedometer needle pushed further to the right, ignoring the glaring red signs that begged for moderation. The city's slumbering state was the only thing that stood between his recklessness and potential disaster. Upon reaching his house, the tranquility of the night was shattered by the screech of metal as Joe misjudged his entry, his car colliding with the gates. Cursing under his breath, he stumbled out of the vehicle, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated from the night's indulgences. With a mix of anger and desperation, he wrestled with the gates, forcing them back into a semblance of closure, all while muttering a string of expletives. So, unbeknownst to him, his actions were under the watchful eye of his father, Chuck, who observed the scene from a shadowed window. The dim light did little to conceal his stern expression, a silent witness to his son's latest folly. As Joe made his way towards the house, the sinking feeling of being watched crept over him. Looking up, he caught sight of his father's silhouette, the realization hitting him like a cold wave. With a frustrated curse, he turned away, seeking refuge in his room, bracing himself for the inevitable storm that was sure to come with the morning sun. Yet morning brought a different kind of silence. There were no stern lectures from Chuck, no disappointed looks from his mother, Linda. The household seemed to carry on as if the night's events were just a figment of his imagination. But the presence of two men quietly repairing the gates spoke volumes, a tangible reminder of his reckless actions. The day stretched on for Joe, unusually long and filled with an unsettling silence. Linda, his mother, who usually played the role of mediator between him and his father's stern ways, seemed to have withdrawn her comforting presence. It was a change that left Joe feeling exposed and unusually reflective. No calls came his way, no inquiries about his well-being, nothing to break the silence that had enveloped the household since the previous night's incident. This lack of communication was foreign to Joe, who had grown accustomed to his mother's nurturing check-ins, regardless of the circumstances. As the evening crept in, Joe found himself devoid of the usual urge to escape the confines of home for the promise of nighttime escapades. Instead, he stayed, the weight of the previous night's actions and the day's ensuing silence holding him down. Dinner time arrived, and with it, a sense of trepidation. Joe hesitated before making his way to the dining room, where he found Chuck and Linda already seated, engaging in a meal shrouded in quietude. The atmosphere was charged with an unspoken tension, a departure from the usual casual banter that accompanied their meals. Taking a deep breath, Joe approached the table and took his seat, attempting to pierce the veil of silence with small talk. "Nice evening, isn't it?" he ventured, his voice sounding foreign in the quiet of the room. His parents' responses were clipped, devoid of the warmth he was accustomed to. "Yes," Linda replied, her gaze fixed on her plate. "No," Chuck added, in response to another of Joe's attempted conversation starters. "I don't know," came the answer to yet another question, their words sparing and measured. The realization dawned on Joe, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, he was faced with the possibility that his parents, his steadfast supporters, through every misstep and misadventure, might have reached the limits of their patience. The thought that they could have given up hope on him was a sobering one, forcing Joe to confront the impact of his actions, not just on himself, but on those who cared for him the most. The quiet of his room felt suffocating after dinner, the silent exchanges at the table replaying in Joe's mind as he lay on his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The weight of the realization that his parents might have lost hope in him was a burden too heavy to bear in silence and stillness. Driven by a restless energy, Joe found himself rising from his bed, drawn to the attic where the past lay in boxes, dusty and forgotten. The attic was a time capsule, each box a gateway to memories long past. He rummaged through them, his hands moving with a purpose he couldn't quite understand, driven by an urge to reconnect with simpler times. His fingers brushed against the spines of old books and the edges of photo albums filled with moments frozen in time. One album in particular caught his eye, its cover worn from years of being untouched. Flipping it open, Joe was greeted by a photograph that sent a jolt of nostalgia through him. There he was, a young boy of 6 or 7, his face lit up with joy, clutching a cotton candy as if it were the world's greatest treasure. The photograph was a portal, transporting him back to